are in the dead zoo, and everything is dead. It's kind of the nature of the building. And some of the specimens we have they're historic, they're old, they were shot a long time ago, or they were collected in some other way a long time ago, and we wouldn't ever collect any more in the same sort of way, because the world has changed and our understanding of things like conservation and the rights of animals to actually exist have changed over time. And so now the museum's much more interested in conservation than it is in collecting. It wasn't always the case. And unfortunately, in parts of the world, that's still not the case. So I'm standing next to an African black rhinoceros here, and that's one of the species which is currently at an extreme risk because of poaching. So people are shooting these magnificent animals in order to get their horns. Now, the horns on this specimen are made of plastic. We replaced the original horn because there's a risk of them getting stolen. And this is a problem for museums all over the place. The problem is much worse actually out in Africa, where the animals are being killed for their horns. And the same sort of problem affects things like the African elephant, where they're being killed for the ivory and the tusks. There are problems with things like pangolins, which are killed for bushmeat and for their scales. They have keratinous scales, which are really unusual for mammals, and they get used in traditional medicine. And so there are various species of that, and bushmeat is a problem for lots of different species, so things like gorillas and chimpanzees are affected by that as well. And these are the sorts of problems which we're quite keen in the museum to try to kind of raise awareness of and address where we can. So one of the other issues that affects quite a lot of species will be changes in habitats because of things like farming and so on, or introduced species, so things like cats and rats and pigs and goats, which get introduced to islands, where they can have quite a big impact on the wildlife in those places. So these are kiwis. They're really weird. They're from New Zealand, and they've kind of adapted to fill the same sort of niche as something like a hedgehog. So they come out at night. They have these whiskers, which you can kind of make out all around the face. They're very unusual for birds because they have their nostrils at the very tip of the bill, and they use that to smell out small invertebrates and things like that. All of those things make them a really quite unique animal, and to lose them would be a real shame. And so the fact that they're endangered because of rats basically destroying their fledglings and the eggs that they lay is a serious problem. And cats will also prey on them. That's the sort of thing that you get in lots of different island species. It's not just the kiwi. Things like the kakapo have similar problems, also from New Zealand. But you have the same sorts of problems even in places like Ireland, where you have introduced species, so zebra mussel and the crayfish, the signal crayfish. These species have an impact on the other species around them, and that can be problematic. And of course you have other problems, so you may just find that there's been a change in the way in which kind of water systems work, or things like overfishing, which will impact on the species. So eels are a good example of a European species that you get in Ireland that used to be very common, and people used to eat quite a lot of eel, and now they're actually incredibly rare. They're on the critically endangered list. So one of the few species in Ireland that is not just at risk in Ireland, but is at risk globally. But in Ireland, we've lost species like the corn bunting and a variety of other species over time, so things like the wolf and so on. So endangered taxa are endangered species are quite common now. It's a big problem. It occurs worldwide. And so it's really useful for the museum to be here to represent what these things look like, so that we kind of understand what we're actually looking after, what we're trying to protect through conservation. But also, people can collect data from these sorts of specimens, things like DNA, which can give you a better idea of how a population was structured in the past before they became very, very rare. And understanding that can help breed species which are you're having breeding programs for, things like the kakapo, to make sure that you maintain as much of that genetic diversity as possible, which is a really important factor. And so things like that potentially will allow things like the Tasmanian devil to avoid extinction, because there are some subpopulations with a slight resistance to a facial tumour which is contagious, which they're currently being really, really heavily affected by. The world is really complex, and the trouble is that there are no simple solutions to problems which seem relatively straightforward. And having knowledge that we can collect from specimens in museums like this are the things which will allow us to address some of those problems in a much more mature and effective way.